Welcome back to the program, and it's a new year, a new relationship with China, it seems, or at least that's according to Chinese Ambassador Xiao Qian, who in a speech this afternoon at the Chinese embassy in Canberra described 2022 as the year of turnaround in Australia's relationship with China.
We had a turnaround last year, turned around from falling behind to stability. And from stability, perhaps to improvement, upholding, and even development. It was a very critical year.
Now, it was a long and wide-ranging Q&A in which Ambassador Qian did many things, including praising the new positive relationship with China embarked upon by Labor and describing the relationship between our two countries as being at a critical juncture. But he also sounded warnings about AUKUS, and all the positive spin can't hide the blatantly obvious, as Japan's ambassador to Australia, Shingo Yamagami, summed up today. He said, quote, "Beware the sting in China's tail." Now, there's so much to unpack here, which is why I really wanted to bring on former defense intelligence analyst and author Paul Monk to talk about this. Paul, thank you so much for joining us. First of all, just very broadly, what did you make of the ambassador's speech this afternoon?
Well, you know, he gave a speech at the National Press Club last year at which he made very clear, very calmly, rather chillingly, that China had no room to give an inch on the matters at issue between our two countries. It was up to Australia to step up, make concessions and correct course. It's very interesting, therefore, to see him today make no real reference to those remarks last year, but to claim at least that relations are now on a sounder footing. I was interviewed after his speech at the National Press Club, and I remarked that ambassadors, or more broadly diplomats, have long been said to be individuals sent abroad to lie for their country, and that this man's a past master at it. He's a smooth operator, and we should take what he says as part of an elaborate diplomatic game and with a substantial grain of salt. We have a long way to go in this relationship, and let me add that China, I think, has become aware over the time period to which he referred that its attempts to coerce Australia and bully Australia have actually not worked. Our trade with China has actually grown, even though some suppliers of things like wine have lost out. We've been able to divert some commodities elsewhere. We haven't lost our net because of their behaviour. And in an important sense, they're now pulling in their horns because they realised it was counterproductive. That's the way I'd pitch it.
Indeed, and I mean, I thought it was quite fascinating. You mentioned the wine before, and he actually raised a glass of red wine and toasted the assembled press corps in Canberra. That's something I've never seen in a lifetime of watching and going to press conferences. And interestingly, I found out that he raised a glass of a Chateau Tanunda Shiraz from the Barossa Valley, which you couldn't even get in China because of the trade restrictions. So how much of what this is really about serving Chinese interests around the economy, but also potentially lulling the Albanese government into a bit of a false sense of security and potentially even away from the US and UK in AUKUS as it A, tries to rebuild its economy post-COVID, and B, continues its plans for expansion in the Pacific?
Well, let me say facetiously that when we talk about Chateau Tanunda, it reminds me of an old Monty Python sketch of many years ago in which they referred to such a wine as Chateau Chunda. And one might at times be tempted to throw up at the antics of the Chinese Communist Party. But this is a serious game. And there's everything to be said for China seeing sense and resuming imports of Australian wine, which is very fine wine. And they only cruel their own consumers by banning our wines. That's straightforward. As to the question of where we go from here, I don't believe on present evidence that the Labor government has sold us short on China. I think that from day one they made clear that the commitments we have to the US alliance, to AUKUS, to our own sovereignty and security, to our force structure redevelopments, to security and the rule of law internationally, all held. What has happened, however, is that Albanese and Penny Wong have reached out to China and said in, let's say, a more diplomatic way, let's at least talk common sense. And it would be my considered judgment that the Chinese government has decided actually we should do that. They want to put as good a face on it as they can, and I would put Ambassador Xiao Qian's raising a toast in that context of symbolism.
And it's also symbolic, of course, also because, we had Shingo-san, the Japanese ambassador's comments today warning Australia and the U.S. about China and China's intentions. Is this part of a balancing act that they're trying to do that will almost make Japan look more hawkish than China?
Well, Japan is a very interesting and significant player in all this, and I'm honoured to say that I count Shingo Yamagami as a personal friend. He's a very fine Japanese ambassador, and for those of your listeners who are unaware of this, he has been sent here as ambassador and plenipotentiary with a clear brief to deepen the relationship with Australia. He's a very accomplished diplomat, and he travels around the country observing it closely for its own sake, and he's a great contributor to what has become the deepening dialogue of what we call the Quad. For China to outbid Japan in that respect, in terms of our trust, is a big ask. And the performance of Xiao Qian today is only the very most modest step in that direction. As long, I would say, as the Communist Party rules China and has the ambitions that it has, and seeks to silence criticism at home and abroad, there is no way that it's going to displace Japan, the United States, and for that matter, India, which plays cricket, speaks English, and has a parliamentary democracy after all. There's no way China is going to displace any of them in their affinity with us. What we can hope, and what I think they want at least, is a stable economic relationship.
Indeed. And of course, the real brass tacks of this for China, I think, was really about the AUKUS agreement, which was at the top of the agenda. Have a look at what the ambassador had to say here.
I don't think AUKUS is a good idea. I don't think it's constructive. I don't think it's helpful, especially when you're targeting China as a potential threat or adversary.
Is this the real sting in the tail, Paul, that the Japanese ambassador was warning about?
It is, so it's presented in a very understated way by Xiao Qian. And let's remember that in his National Press Club address last year, he spoke in all but threatening terms about the situation, saying, among other things, China will resume sovereignty over Taiwan, whatever it takes. And when it has done so, it will re-educate the Taiwanese people to understand their place within the Chinese world. This in immediate wake of what's been done in Hong Kong. That's the real China. And any soft soap talk from its ambassador, polished though he be, is not going to change that. We need to see actions, not smooth words. There's a deficit of trust in this country for China, given the behaviour of the Chinese regime since Xi Jinping took office, and that's not going to be easily changed.
Indeed. And just before I let you go, Paul, you're now working on a follow-up to your book, Thunder from the Silent Zone, Rethinking China. How much have these recent developments, even, developments we've seen in the last couple of days, shaped your work on this new volume?
Well, the main reason we're republishing the book is because when it was written 18 years ago, almost everybody in governments across the Western world, in industry, were wedded to the idea that China's rise would be more or less endless, and that it would be benign, that the rising tide would lift all boats, and that China's institutions would in all probability open up and liberalise along the way somewhere, much as those of Japan, South Korea and Taiwan had done. And my argument in the book when it was first published was that we needed to think in terms of a number of divergent scenarios. That was one that may seem plausible, but there were a lot of variables to focus on which were being ignored, it seemed to me. And I suggested there were three other scenarios that we should consider as possible futures over the following 20 years. Those were what I call the maturation scenario, where China got stuck in the middle income trap, the metastasis scenario, in which the Communist Party's refusal or inability to push through reforms that would make the economy more open and sustainable, the failure to undertake those reforms would lead to implosion. And the third or fourth scenario was militarisation, in which it would put an inordinate amount of resources into a military build-up and threaten or use military force. And the reason to reissue it is because now that mutation scenario, the first one of benign growth, is off the table. All three of the others are actually in play. And so it's timely to reissue the book with a few updates, but the primary purpose is to remind people we must think in terms of divergent scenarios and not feckless predictions.
Paul Monk, I cannot wait to read the new updated version of that. But thank you so much for joining us, and we'll chat to you again soon.